Welcome to Restoring Christ website. I'm Arturo. I'm here with my friend.
Santiago and Pio.
Yeah, and then I'm Arturo. This is Restoring Christ, the website. I'm finishing my bachelor's degree in history. I have an associate's right now in history as well and business administration. And yeah, I thought this would be a good topic to discuss in regard to Dignitatis Humanae and Catholic social teaching regarding church and state, particularly for, I thought it was an important thing to discuss for two reasons. The first one, it's the election cycle. So I thought it would be a good idea to kind of discuss concepts regarding church and state for Catholics who want to better understand not only how to vote, but what is the church and what is the state. And the second main important reason, it's because for a lot of people that might not know, this is the main crucial issue, facing the Society of St. Pius X. A lot of people might not know, for the Society of St. Pius X was started by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. A lot of people that do know about the society know that, they had issues regarding the Mass, but they don't know that, they might not know that it's actually Dignitatis Humanae and kind of their misconception regarding its interpretation that is actually at the crux of why their society was founded to begin with. So some background in regard to the topic, it's in regard to kind of the difference between the hermeneutic of continuity and discontinuity. So it's all about the mode of interpretation in regard to what we're about to discuss right now regarding Dignitatis Humanae and what the Church post-Vatican II teaches regarding church and state. It's that it's the same as what the Church always taught. Dignitatis Humanae uses language like, developing and then declaring. So as we'll see, Dignitatis Humanae and the magisterium, following the Second Vatican Council was just building up on the proper interpretation in regard to the church and state. And I thought it would be a good idea just kind of noting some individuals, both in regard to individuals that interpreted Dignitatis Humanae in such a way that it caused kind of like a rupture from church teaching, both from the left and the right. So some of the individuals that are mentioned as being as giving an interpretation following a spirit of rupture, it's John Courtney Murray, Hugh Felice, Robert D. Lamennais. It's a French name. And also, to some extent, I believe Thomas Pink mentions Jacques Maritain, and he doesn't seem as radical as like John Courtney Murray or Lamennais. I think Thomas Pink just mentions that he doesn't agree with the conclusion that he came about. But Lamennais and John Courtney Murray were the more kind of radical conclusions, where John Courtney Murray kind of gave into Americanism, which is kind of like a complete separation of church and state. And I believe Lamennais, which is from this book right here, he mentions he was a French cleric and intellectual during the Enlightenment who believed that the church ought to kind of just cede all her rights in order to live in a modern world. So Thomas Pink, Reverend Brian Harrison, and a few others tried to kind of correct the interpretation of church and state regarding Dignitatis Humanae. And then before we proceed further, do you have anything to add?
Just I've read a lot of different, in my search to try and find the hermeneutic of continuity for Dignitatis Humanae. You do come across so many different ways you can rupture the tradition, as you mentioned, from the left and the right.
Yeah.
And if I could just sort of like state really clearly what those ruptures kind of are generally, for people on the left, the rupture comes in the form of seeing Dignitatis Humanae as repudiating what came before. So it's always a repudiation, and even a direct contradiction. Or if they don't say that outright, they'll say that historical context in like the medieval times necessitated a certain kind of social doctrine for the church with respect to religious liberty and the church-state relations. But now that we've evolved, and all those principles are invalid, they're unusable. And that might sound like what Pink is saying, but he actually holds that there are consistent principles underlying this social doctrine in the from the medieval times to modern times. And then you have the harder one to deal with is the from the right, and this is more like the SSPX camp, is that they and I've actually, this whole year, it's interesting you got me at this time, Art. I've actually been in dialogue with a friend in the SSPX who goes to my college. And it was really interesting because he tried really hard throughout this year to respond to Pink and give objections in his views to Pink. And so I had the privilege of kind of seeing a robust debate about Pink. And at the end of the day, I still think Pink comes out victorious. But one of the ways that I noticed that this well-meaning SSPX friend of mine kept rupturing tradition is that he said that the words of the words of the text of Dignitatis Humanae so flatly contradict the predications of the older popes on the exact same words. So basically that's just to say the old teaching said there is no right to religious liberty, and now the new teaching says there is a right to religious liberty. And so he said, from the very simple predication of what there is, you see an absolute contradiction. It either is or it's not. It's the law of contradiction, of non-contradiction. And he said, because it so flatly contradicts what came before, even though the document itself throws in so many phrases about continuity, it is irrelevant. And in fact, it's mere confusion, and it's diabolical. You know, it's meant to confuse what is supposed to be clear, and give the illusion that there's continuity where there's not, because there's clear contradiction. There's also some subtle points about natural law that Pink makes that we'll get into later. But they also take objection, or at least the SSPX people that I talk to, that you could even have some kind of delegation of authority in religious matters to the state, because the SSPX believe that it would be native to the state's authority to have religion as one of its objects of coercion. And a coercion itself is another debate, right? You know, and among even more moderate thinkers, including, you mentioned Harrison, for example, Father Harrison, a lot of people who try to reconcile Dignitatis Humanae with the earlier papal teaching will base it in just order exceptions, appeals to like the common good, and the objective morality stuff that is mentioned in Dignitatis Humanae. But as we'll see from Pink, those terms have precise meanings that don't actually touch upon the religious order. So we can't just say that Dignitatis Humanae is hiding in plain sight a just order exception that would allow for states, whenever they wish, to start violating the right to religious liberty that it posits.
Yeah. And with that being said, as before we proceed further, I thought it would be a good idea just kind of noting some key phrases that we're going to cover right now, for people to be well versed in what we're talking about right now. So there's two things we should distinguish. One is the church, and the other's the state. And what they hold in common is that they both have humans, which is the proper subject of both. So the church and the state are both perfect societies, existing in their own right. They're both a natural and divine institution, and because they both have humans as their subject, we touch upon the notion of what is known as the common good, and then there's two types of common goods that pertain to man. There's the temporal common good and the spiritual common good. In regard to the temporal common good, there's a few different kind of aspects to it, but one of them is our temporal welfare, getting all the basic necessities. But more fundamental than that, it's also, as Aristotle would say, it's an active life in virtue, and the purpose of the state, is to create laws that facilitate virtue and virtuous living, and so the state is bound, by the natural law, and to another extent too, the divine moral law, even though that's particularly definitely true in regard to the church, it's still the state is bound by both those, whereas the church is concerned with the spiritual common good of man, which is the final end of man, which is eternal bliss in heaven, making sure that individuals have the deposit of faith, and making sure that there's no hindrance to their eternal salvation. This also gets us into the notion of kind of, and then Pink goes further into it in regard to the soul body theory of church and state, particularly. And when you read very old documents, I think Unum Sanctum and various other ones, they talk about kind of like the two swords. So basically, like we're alive right now. We're a composite of a soul and a body. So the church and the state, it's analogous to the state being the body and the church being the soul. And what I think Pink mentioned, it's that you can't have a perfect union, without the soul and the body, just as you can have one, you can't have a perfect union without both the church and the state. That's in its ideal form. So just in a nutshell, civil authority, which is government, has the duty to promulgate and administer laws. And so in kind of having a proper understanding of the state, I would say it's very different from either a libertarian understanding of what the state is, as well as kind of like an arbitrary just understanding, kind of like someone like Hobbes would have, which the state, it's like a leviathan that can just do whatever it wants. So the proper state has the duty to promulgate and administer laws, provide for domestic safety against domestic and foreign invasion, which most would, kind of agree with. But in addition to this, so there is a notion of the church, or the state having coercive authority in general in temporal matters, but Dignitatis Humanae also clearly states that the state has the active role of, and the active kind of necessity of promoting religion and and good morals, to the extent that it pertains to the temporal common good of man. I think another thing to kind of lay down, it's because of our fallen human nature, due to the to concupiscence and original sin, that touches upon grace, and the fact that grace not only heals but elevates human nature. We have the natural law, which is concerned with the good and pertaining to something's nature, and particularly pertaining to the right use of things. The divine moral precepts, which are the divinely revealed laws of God, which are summarized in the Ten Commandments. And one of the last terms, it's in regard to the church, just like the state, it's a perfect society. Once again, we mentioned that it's concerned with the spiritual common good. What a lot of people, and this is, I believe, at the heart of what Thomas Pink mentioned, so we'll go deeper into this, but it's that the nature of baptism, and that, right when someone is baptized, not only are they engrafted and made members of the church, but they're under the authority of the church, which Thomas Pink mentions that, even within kind of like just the magisterium right now, there's not a lot of emphasis in this aspect of baptism. The church is the infallible guide who not only interprets divine revelation, such as scripture, but also the natural law. And this is also at the heart of Thomas Pink, that the church does indeed have coercive authority in regard to baptism. And I'll let you add more into this right now. The last thing I was going to mention is that I think a great aspect, how you mentioned in regard to coercion before. So the Dignitatis Humanae, what it develops is that the state by itself doesn't have the native right to coerce in regard to religion. But at the same time, the church does, because the church, through baptism, obviously you can't force someone into the faith. But when they're baptized, if I understand Thomas Pink correctly, it's that the essence of baptism is the keeping of the faith. So it's the external promises that individuals have to the church regarding baptism, and the essence of baptism and the promise of baptism. It's an upholding of the faith. Is there anything you wanted to add or modify? Or
Yeah, this is probably one of the most important points, because well, let me say this first. The reason baptism kind of changes everything, as it were, is that, as you mentioned, it is a promise, right? We always talk about keeping the promises of our baptism, and promises impose rights and duties, right? You have a right to the sacraments because of your baptism, as long as you are not sinful. But then you also have duties to keep the faith, to form yourself, and to persevere, right? Now, it might seem strange because Pink really relies on, Trent's canons against, I forget what his name is. It's not Eusebius. Can you help me out? What's his, starts with an E. But there's one. Erasmus. There you go. Yeah. Erasmus stated, hey, why don't we baptize kids? But once they get to a certain, the age of reason, or maybe like when they're in puberty, we ask them if they want to still be Catholics. And if they don't, then we just sort of keep the sacraments away from them until they have a change of heart. But we wouldn't ever force them to keep promises that they made when they were babies, and they weren't even made by them. Strictly speaking, they were made by their godparents.
Yeah.
The church condemns that view as heresy. And the reason why, according to St. Thomas, is that when we are baptized, we are a new creature in Christ. Our soul is actually transformed to be the kind of thing that is disposed to truth, especially to reveal truth. And like, there was a priest who once told me an interesting story, and I'll just leave it on his authority. It's anecdotal, but it's very helpful for me, at least. He said in his catechism, when he was doing CCD, he could always, according to him, he could always tell if there was a kid who was baptized and a kid who was not baptized in his class, because he noticed through his years of, catechism, that the kids who were baptized seemed, even if they were sinful, even if they had a lot of heretical opinions, they still had a stronger inclination that's almost inexplicable to want to know why the church teaches what it teaches. They want to know the truth, or they're even unsatisfied with some of the lies that they believed, and even if they didn't know it yet, they had more of a desire, more of a hunger that he couldn't really explain until it really dawned on him that, oh, they really did receive a sacrament that is supposed to help them receive more grace that will dispose them and help them to believe. So to the extent that we do believe that babies were given that grace, and we believe it was an effusive grace, or I don't even know if that's a real word, but yeah, I'm not trying to say effusive, kind of like a flowing grace, like a torrent. That's a better word. We really do believe the sacraments are powerful and that they are filled with grace. Just think of Pentecost, right? And baptism too. And so a person who is baptized really does have all the help that they need, at least on the spiritual level, to be able to accept these revealed truths. And so when they don't, or they fail, the church is justified to kind of, like a good shepherd, keep the sheep back, push them back into the fold, because they should know better. And to put it in another way, either by sin or ignorance, they are not keeping their promises, but we really do believe they have the graces to keep them. And it's not just some kind of extrinsic force that has nothing to do with their actual potency to be able to believe.
Yeah. I definitely think that the analogy you just gave, it's profound about, in regard to baptism itself. And, like, I think, as Thomas Pink mentions, baptism is particularly probably one of the aspects of kind of modern ecclesiology that kind of, it's not really emphasized. Not only that it's, not only that you become a member of the church, but a lot of kind of like the external aspects that come with it, such as the keeping of the faith, which includes, or the keeping of the faith. It's intrinsic to baptism itself. The other aspect, as we're talking about this, it's I wanted to quote, in regard to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2105, particularly. So paragraph 2105 states, the duty of offering God genuine worship concerns man both individually and socially. This is the traditional Catholic teaching on the moral duty of individuals and societies towards the true religion and the one Church of Christ. By constantly evangelizing man, the Church works towards enabling them to infuse the Christian spirit into the mentality and mores, laws, and structures of the communities in which they live. End quote. So the reason I mentioned that particular aspect is because both, I believe, Thomas Pink and specifically Brian Harrison, he particularly shows that it's actually a dogma that the state owes not just any worship but exclusive worship to the one true faith, which I believe it's in the First Vatican Council that it defines the true religion as the Catholic religion. And obviously Brian Harrison mentions that this kind of dogma of giving explicit recognition to the Catholic faith doesn't have to be specifically written down in a constitution. That's just one form. Mm-hmm. But the state and civil society as a whole does owe that particular. I mean, it is a dogma that holds mm-hmm. In all of society together. And the way that I kind of think about it, it's that each individual has an obligation to the truth, and when we talk about justice, we're talking about a cardinal virtue, which means giving everyone according to their due. And then St. Thomas Aquinas mentions that religion, it's what we owe God. So it's an extension of justice to the things that pertain to God. And I believe St. Augustine also kind of mentions this in his book, The City of God. So society, it's nothing else than the collection of individuals. So just as that kind of dogma, and just as each individual is bound to truth and justice, it only makes sense that society, which is a collection of individuals and civil authority being in charge of individuals, has that same duty. So it's just an application that extends from an individual to society as a whole.
Yes, and that it's worth stressing that public and exclusive recognition of the Catholic faith is not obsolete, even in Dignitatis Humanae. And that's and we should probably define what that means, because some people, most likely Americans listening, will think, what does it mean for the state to give exclusive public recognition of the true religion? Does it mean that like every non-Catholic has to be deported? that's not at all what the church was saying in the past, and it's not what the church is saying now either. But what it is saying is that that if we have a duty to the truth, objective truth, as individuals, to recognize God privately in our lives, as you said, Art, it's not, that duty is not going to change when we all gather together. And so we do have to acknowledge publicly. So separation of church and state is not something that we can hold, at least in the way the United States in particular understands it. I mean, obviously it's the law of the land, and we need to submit to it, just as if we were under, for example, a Muslim caliph who tolerated Christianity. That's it. You know, we're under those laws. But I guess what I wanted to say with that is on Dignitatis Humanae, paragraph 6, you see it explicitly talk about how the right to religious liberty is compatible with having a confessional state. I mean, off the top of my head, the first two examples that come to mind, one is a good example, one is a bad example. You'll see what I mean by good and bad. The first one is Poland. Poland, which is a democracy, has recently declared through their laws, and their presidency was their president did a ceremony with the Archbishop of Krakow, I think, where they declared Christ as the King of Poland.
Yeah, I remember.
A beautiful thing. Was it the end of the world? Were Polish Lutherans thrown into jail for that public recognition of Christ the King, or were non-Christians kicked out of Poland for that reason? No. But and then another example would be Great Britain itself. Great Britain has a state church. People forget it has the Anglican Church, but through its practices, it has recognition of what it thinks is, you know, its true religion. Although if you know a lot of Anglicans, they probably aren't. They're probably universalists at this point. But it's still interesting that they don't see, as the American founding fathers kind of did, in Britain, they don't see that connection anymore between having a confessional church and not having religious freedom at the same time. And it's true historically that religious freedom and having a confessional state seem to not be compatible, but Dignitatis Humanae is entertaining that they can be. So anyways, I should quote Dignitatis Humanae at this point on paragraph 6, kind of towards the end, or section 6. Section 6. He says, if because of the circumstances of a particular people, special civil recognition is given to one religious community in the constitutional organization of a state, the right of all citizens and religious communities to religious freedom must be recognized and respected as well. So it's important to mention that, because I will hear a lot of like slippery slope arguments from SSPXers too, you know, that like, because there's a right to religious liberty, therefore Christ is not king. He is denied all sorts of rights, and it's contrary to the public recognition of him. It's basically secularism. There's a lot of nuance to that argument. Whether you mean, is it tending towards an ultimate atheistic secularism, or if that already is there, you know, materially. But at the very least, we can say this at this point before we go more into it, that the Second Vatican Council envisions that the reign of Christ the King, the public recognition that we should give to him, and exclusively in the public sphere, to the exclusion of other religions, is not incompatible per se with religious freedom.
Yeah. And just for people to kind of have a good understanding, I was just going to distinguish that. So, you know, there's the dogma of, you know, like the explicit recognition of, you know, of the Catholic faith. And then there's the other, that it's kind of church discipline, as far as the state. You know, we covered that the state can't by itself, in its own native authority, coerce religion. But, you know, when it's combined with the church can use it as, you know, as its secular arm, as it's done in the past. Right now, the church discipline is that, you know, the state can't do that. So the reason I mention this, because I think a lot of, even particularly amongst individuals that are from the SSPX or traditionalists, kind of blurred the lines of, you know, the dogmatic aspect and, you know, church policy. And the other thing I was going to mention too, I think Thomas Paine mentioned that, how you mentioned about religious freedom. It's particularly important too, where he kind of explains why it's the practical importance of a state kind of publicly acknowledging the Catholic faith. And what he mentions is that when it comes to religious freedom, as you notice in a lot of like truly secular societies, the notion of what constitutes freedom, duties, and specifically religious freedom, just as any other types of rights, are very misconstrued. And so the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church particularly, which is the infallible proper guide of faith and morals, just as she properly interprets scripture, it's important that the state it's guided through the Catholic faith, because we can't it's very hard not to have an objective understanding of all of the rights and duties and what these things properly consist of, if unless it's through the Catholic faith properly, obviously through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, properly kind of laying down the true metaphysical notions of what these things are.
Yeah, Pink makes a good point towards the end of his thesis, basically saying that in a society that the right to religious liberty that Dignitatis Humanae proposes is a very religious version of the right to religious liberty, if that makes any sense. Basically, it's not one that's based off of secular Enlightenment liberalism. It's one that presupposes that religion is something good and is something that actually transcends the authority of the state, and which is the basis by which you can say the state doesn't have any native authority over it. And that is a religious teaching, that religion is true or good and that it transcends state authority. Atheists won't accept that. For atheists, religious freedom is just another species of free speech, right? It's not a particular good in its own right. And so and we're seeing this already in America now, when you don't have the church, kind of permeating all levels of society, publicly and privately and whatnot, informing the consciences of the citizenry through laws and the customs of the nation, to know the natural law clearly. When you don't have that, then it's going to start drifting away from the true foundations of natural law. You're going to stop seeing religion, the right to freedom of religion, as rooted in its nature as a supernatural good, and you'll just see it in terms of my own freedom in the secular Enlightenment sense, that like nobody can tell me what to do. And when that starts to happen, then religion is just equated with any number of opinions, right? And then you'll see it, the courts in America, they grow skeptical, right, of even morality itself. And they just see, you're, for example, no fault divorce. Stop imposing your values on adults who want to freely consent and then not consent to marriage, right? Whereas we would say, oh no, they have a duty in the natural law, in nature, by, ratified by God, to stay together, raise their families, or work through their marriages. And the state will basically say, well, that's just a religious opinion, as if to kind of discredit that that's actually founded in nature itself. But you're starting to see that you kick the religion out of the sphere of public life, then we start to even kick the natural out too, because the religious element was always strengthening and confirming the intellect that's darkened by the fall, to see that. So Art, I think probably is a good time to start getting into the crux of Pink's argument. We've kind of been talking around it. Do you need me to give like a little quick summary of it?
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So the main holding of Professor Pink is that the continuity of Dignitatis Humanae with the traditional papal teaching lies in the existence of two orders of coercion. Now, what do we mean by that? It basically means that different kinds of authority, so religious authority or civil authority, have a realm, a sphere of influence where they can, punish, make laws, correct, and teach and whatnot. And so there's two of those spheres, at least in this discussion. And the civil authority sphere pertains to the common good, temporal goods, as you mentioned, and the proximate end of man as known by nature in this life. And then then there's also a spiritual order, the spiritual coercive order, that has to do with explicitly religious things. And the way Pink defines it, I'll just kind of open it up to here. Let's see. He says, this is Pink quotes Leo XIII in Immortale Dei, quote, "Whatever therefore in things human is in any way of a sacred character, whatever belongs either of its own nature or by reason of the end to which it is referred, to the salvation of souls or to the worship of God, falls wholly within the power of the church and is wholly subject to her judgment. Whatever is to be ranged under the civil and political order is rightly subject to the civil authority. Jesus Christ himself has given command that what is Caesar's is to be rendered to Caesar, and what it belongs to God is to be rendered unto God," close quote. So that's an important quote. From that's where everything else flows, Dignitatis Humanae and Pink's thesis.
And
yes.
That's where we get where he both Thomas Pink as well as kind of Leonine and Jesuit political theory kind of start grasping the twofold division of this church or the soul and body theory in the church and state, and the division of what pertains to the church and what pertains to the state in regard to the temporal and spiritual common good.
Mm-hmm. And so Pink kind of, from that understanding of, okay, we have two orders of life, then there's two distinct authorities with competency in those orders properly. As you can imagine, whatever is about the political order simply and temporal goods, food, roads, crime, and whatnot, in a temporal sense at least, that is all under the king, the president, the republic, whatever you name it. And then whatever has to do with, and we have to be very clear about this because this could be a controversy I've seen in my arguments with SSPXers, whatever is of a sacred character or belongs of its own nature or by reason of the end to which it is referred, to the salvation of souls or to the worship of God, that's entirely under the church's authority. So let's put a bookmark there, because I think there's a lot of objections SSPXers will already have to the way Pink interprets that. But to just get the summary out, if that's true, the reason those two things are true is that according to Jesuit Counter-Reformation theology, and St. Robert Bellarmine endorses this, Suarez endorses this, and Suarez was commissioned by the Pope to endorse this. So, and they're writing mostly against Protestant England at this time. The basis for the authority in both is that first, God gave authority to civil rulers to have authority in temporal levels, in the temporal sphere, but he also gave authority to the church. But as you mentioned at the start of this discussion, Art, they are both perfect societies. And by they, I mean the church and the state. And by perfect societies, what we mean by that is that they have everything they need to be basically have their own authority and rule. So when we say that the state is a perfect society, we mean it has police power, it has lawmaking power, and it can enforce its own laws. There's nothing lacking, right, in its authority to bring about the end that it's aiming at. But in the church, a lot of people have this assumption that, like, the church proposes spiritual things and it makes even laws, but it can't enforce any of them, right? Except by just withdrawing maybe a privilege like communion or something like that. But it can only enforce those kind of spiritual penalties, and it can't actually do anything. It has no physical force to make people keep their promises. Well, that's wrong. According to, if you look at the canons, the Code of Canon Law, the way the church has always understood its authority is that because it's a perfect society, it even has its own kind of temporal like authority, or its physical authority to to enforce its own religious laws over the baptized. That's a key thing. Over those who are baptized.
And canon law particularly uses language like, penal penalties in regard to certain crimes. It's not as extensive as the 1917 Code of Canon Law, but it's still in the 1983 Code of Canon Law. So regardless of which one you're looking at, you can clearly see language kind of just touching over concrete penalties over the baptized if there's certain kind of obligations they didn't meet, whether it's for the clergy or the laity.
And if you want a clear example of the church exercising authority to enforce its laws, like even with corporal punishment, as it were, you actually see that with St. Peter, with the case of, I always forget the husband's name. It's not Annas and Sapphira.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Annas and Sapphira, or Ananias? What's his name? It's not Ananias.
I thought it was Ananias.
Ananias? Okay,
yeah,
Ananias and Sapphira. This was a Christian couple in the early church.
In Acts 5, right? Or
in Acts 5, yeah. And they were basically, they were caught withholding money from the apostolic purse. So back in those days, it was, I guess, the unspoken law of the church, or the custom at least, their sacred tradition, to own everything in common, to give them to the disciples and the apostles, so that they can then distribute to the poor from the common owned stuff that the Christians had at the time. Well, Ananias and Sapphira withhold stuff from that. They withhold personal wealth and possessions from that common apostolic purse or collection, as it were. And St. Peter confronts them about it, and he condemns them. And St. Peter doesn't just say, oh, you can't receive communion, or just you're kicked out of the church. He prays for the Lord to strike them down dead. In other words, he executes the death penalty. So we cannot say that the church doesn't have any authority to enforce even the highest corporal punishment as a perfect society, to enforce its own laws, because St. Peter did it.
And I was just going to say, I know it's not, it's not exactly the same, but to a certain extent it is. Even in regard to like the sexual abuse scandals, I remember reading, that even Pope Pius XII, up to that time would, like, if someone was caught in the act in the Vatican, they would immediately have them executed. So I think that's the most modern example of of the church using, in this case, the secular arm, but nevertheless through its authority, over an ecclesial crime committed within church grounds.
Mm-hmm. It's important that the church can't just do this to anyone and for any reason. It has to be on a baptized person, because only the baptized are under the spiritual order of the church's coercive authority. And it could only be if it's about something of a religious matter, right? Or if, for example, you mentioned the priest that Pope Pius XII apparently executed. He's a priest. He's conferred holy orders. His soul is changed by that sacred character. He is basically church property in a sense, right? That he's part of the church, and basically all that happens to him, it concerns what is sacred, because he is a priest, and everything he does touches on that.
And I think the other great example, it's actually from St. Robert Bellarmine. I don't have the book in front of me, but it's a big collection of by St. Robert Bellarmine. I believe the English kind of translation of the title of the book, it's on the laity, but it particularly, it's a collection of 3 books, but basically through most of the book, he touches upon the temporal authority of the Pope over the baptized, which he calls it an indirect temporal authority. Basically, the way it manifests is either, let's say that there's a ruler that it's making, in this case, most of its citizens are baptized Catholics, whether the leader himself is baptized or not. But nevertheless, let's say in this hypothetical example, the leader is making, in this case, the leader has legitimate authority. He's civil authority, but let's say he's making them kind of like either he's making the individuals not able to fulfill their religious duties, or even worse, like trying to make them commit idolatry. So the Saint Robert Bellarmine states that the church, particularly the Pope, can withhold, the civil obligation of the baptized in that land from giving allegiance to that leader. And by doing that, he's basically stripping the political authority of the leader, since he doesn't have individuals to follow the civil law of the land anymore. And then the second example, it's in the case of baptized leaders, the church, as she has done in the past, could also make it, not only can the church, as she has done, excommunicate certain leaders, but can also excommunicate individuals that are associated with such a leader. So and like you mentioned earlier, this is only this only applies in situations where you have baptized individuals that are engrafted to the church. So the church couldn't apply this to just anyone in general.
Yes. Yeah, those are all it's really key to understand how this is all rooted in baptism, because the moment you forget that, is the moment you start getting more confusion between the two orders. And I think this is a good place to mention, in our overall summary, that what changes the state of this almost, it seems, radical distinction between what the state can do in its sphere of influence and what the church does in its sphere of influence, right? Like, when do we get to the point where the papal encyclicals of the Enlightenment era start saying that, it's a body and soul relation, they're working together, and the state could be the secular arm? Like, what? How is that? How does that match? And the way Pink answers it is, he says that the moment the society becomes Christian through baptism, so either the king gets baptized or the whole of society is just full of baptized peoples, that's, historically at least, when they would have a Christian duty to begin to utilize their offices in the political realm to safeguard the religious goods and whatnot. And the key thing is that the church, and this is Pink's thesis, is that the church delegated that authority to the state. It's not something the state can just assume to itself, or say that it has over and against what the church says. Once they become baptized, because they're subject to the church, then the church can direct those people subject to it now to carry out certain things for the good of religion in the civil order. But it's important to note that in canon law, whenever the church is calling upon the state to do something, like, for example, say somebody is, excommunicated, and they need to be, kicked out of the town or something like that. Like, it's trying to enforce, maybe the church banishes somebody, right? But the church probably doesn't have the means to enforce that. Although it can, if it was like the papal states, right? And it didn't have to rely on any, if it had its own army or something. But usually the church doesn't have an army at hand. So the church has a right to say to its Christian king, hey, your kingly power is not just for temporal things. I am asking you, and you have a duty to obey me as someone who is baptized, to help me enforce this banishment of this person, right? And that person can do, and that king can enforce it. But when he's doing that, he's not acting on authority he had on himself, according to Pink. He is acting as a delegate of the church, right? And so that's why the very name, the secular arm, implies it's the arm of what? It's the arm of the church, right? And it's a right the church can make use of or not, as she does now. She does not make use of that often, if at all. But whenever canon law talks about the civil authorities just acting for regular goods like public order, peace, the economy and whatnot, that's not acting as the secular arm of the church. That is just acting on its own native authority.
Yeah. And then what I was going to add right now, kind of leading towards the, end of the discussion, but particularly, I thought it was good, particularly also to show that, or giving the distinction of, kind of religion and religious acts and how they pertain to the natural law. This is mostly coming from Brian or Father Brian Harrison, but particularly he kind of shows that, like right now, even though the state can't exclusively like coerce in matters of religion, she can coerce in matters of religion or religious acts that contradict natural law. So what he mentions, it's particularly, for example, there's a few examples, but let's say kind of like the more radical, like anti-Catholic literature, let's say coming from someone like Jack Chick, which is just completely filled with historical errors, then that's different, because in this regard, it's not just kind of like religious propaganda, but it's exclusively like portraying lies, so that a lie, it's contrary to natural law. So in that case, it crosses the line. So does things like polytheism, since polytheism by its very nature, it's not pertaining to the natural law, which is monotheistic in general. Things like polygamy, and even things like Satanism. So like a lot of traditionalists would try to undermine Dignitatis Humanae, saying, how about these things? But these things are not really religion as properly understood, because something like Satanism, it's the complete opposite of religion is supposed to be, which is an allegiance to God, and religion is based on the objective notion of justice, whereas some of these different forms of quote-unquote religion actually deviate from the objective understanding of what Dignitatis Humanae had in regard to religion.
Oh, this is probably really good that you brought me on for this, because Pink actually complicates that view of Harrison, Father Harrison, a little bit. I remember reading Harrison and thinking to myself, is Dignitatis Humanae, just as it's affirming a right to religious liberty, hiding in plain sight an exemption for so religious liberty doesn't apply to pagans or Satanists or atheism, right? But the problem is with that interpretation, I think, of Father Harrison, is that Dignitatis Humanae, at least with atheists, explicitly says, even with those people that do not fulfill their duty to seek out God and religious truth, the right to religious liberty, or that liberty of conscience, still applies to them. And I think it's also the mind of the church that the religious liberty said at Dignitatis Humanae would apply even to pagans. I think Satanism is an interesting edge case. I won't say that. I think that's so diabolically opposed to all that's good and holy. But yeah, that's interesting. I won't say anything about that, but I will say with atheism, it seemed like especially Dignitatis Humanae had that on its mind. That could be a possible exception, that Catholics who understand the natural law would want to say, oh yeah, atheism is against the natural law because it's self-evident that God exists.
Yeah, so I think kind of Thomas Paine kind of just kind of clarifies, showing that it has to be particularly not so much kind of like the religious notion or the lack of religious notion, but the acts themselves that are committed, whether they're like introducing particular kind of just acts that are by their very nature preventing others from following their religious kind of their religious duties.
Yeah. Like a black mass, I think, is one of those things that I don't think the public has to ever accord any space for that, as we try to do in America. That's just my first gut check. It seems right to say. But to kind of comment on what I think Pink was laying out, this brings up another important point we should bring up. So, because we really haven't really even finished the full argument, if you think about it. So because of the two distinctive coercive orders, based off of two perfect societies, the church and the state, the fact that baptism, changes the way the citizens of one coercive order need to now act with respect to the second one, then you get the body soul union. But and this is the crowning point of Pink's thesis, when the state severs itself from the church, it either doesn't acknowledge it or the church refuses to employ it. You have a situation where the state is, again, it goes back to only what authority it has on its own. So it cannot claim to have authority over religion, because the authority that is really competent over that, which is the church, is not giving it any, or it's rejected the authority. And that's how you get a right to religious liberty that this can't be stressed enough, is never grounded on the fact that we have a right to profess error. Even the modern catechism of the Catholic Church even says that the right to religious liberty and conscience is not the freedom to err, like it's a good and right thing that you should err, just like the right to be a father, the right over your children. That's good, right? But when you're using your religious liberty to profess a false religion, that's not good. But that's not the right to religious liberty isn't, as Dignitatis Humanae envisions it, is not saying that how they use their right is good. All it's saying is that you have a right to be free from coercion from a particular authority.
Yeah, which is the state. Yeah,
which is the state in this case. And so that's where your right comes from. And it's kind of parallel. I think Dr. John Lamont makes a comparison with how the church has always recognized, and St. Thomas says this in the Summa, that the state, even if it's like a Catholic state, if, say, for example, there's a Jewish child and the state has some purview over the spiritual good of its citizens, if it's a Catholic state, and it might want to say, hey, those Jewish kids need to be baptized and raised Catholics against the wishes of their parents. And St. Thomas affirmed that that's actually wrong. It's against their rights as parents, because they properly have the right to educate their child prior. Pope Leo XIII says this himself: the rights of parents do predate the state; they're antecedent to the state. So the state, no matter how Catholic it is and how much it wants to care for the good of those kids, can't infringe on those parental rights. Well, the SSPX then, don't realize that when they say that, the fact that the church is acknowledging the state doesn't have any authority over religion native to it, they think, oh, well, that's creating a conflict between then the natural law and the divine positive law. It's saying that they could be in conflict with each other. But then you would have to, you would have to hold then that when a Catholic state respects the rights of Jewish parents over their children to raise them Jewish, that there's a conflict in natural law, because somehow natural law is giving parents a loophole to be free from divine law. That's not the case at all. If you don't see a conflict with the one, you can't see a conflict with the other, or at least we need to reconcile it. I actually need to think more about that. I would really love to see the principle at work between those two things. But when you have a conflicting of a right based in the natural law and a right based in, divine positive law, this does not mean necessarily that there is like some sort of conflict in God's ordering of all the laws, right? It just means that there are certain authorities that are not ordained by God in certain scenarios to act in certain ways in certain spheres. The proper authorities can, and that's part of providence. That's how God ordered the universe. I began this little tangent because we were mentioning. Oh gosh, you got to remind me, Arturo. What was the last thing that you were talking about? It was
the last thing was kind of like Brian Harrison's kind of like in regard to like the kind of like conceptions that seem to deviate from natural law, whether it's atheism or and he kind of talks about the acts. So he talks about religions that are contrary to natural law, but he also mentions the religious acts that seem to contradict natural law.
So thank you for reminding me of that. So what Pink ends up concluding by the end of his thesis is that, and this is to kind of save, I think, what natural law says about those acts, because we're not wrong when we say that atheism, Satanism, and paganism are against the natural law. And the church has held that according to natural reason, before the coming of Christ, rulers really did have some kind of authority over religious matters native to themselves, right? They had a right to make sure their citizens were monotheists, that they were and not atheists or pagans, because those were evident in the natural law. And through reason, you could know that that's the best way to order your society, right? Yeah. But what Pink says, and what he kind of confirms by quoting, I think even Bellarmine himself,
and this is towards the end of Pink's argument, right?
Yeah, this is
yeah.
He says that baptism, or sorry, he says that the coming of Christ actually changes who has competency over religion. So in the natural law before Christ, it is true to say that the state had native authority over natural religion, or at least religion as you can know it from your reason. And it had coercive authority in that respect. But once Christ came and instituted revelation and spiritual authority in men on earth, the apostles, now that is a true principle with actual competence that supersedes and overrides whatever the rulers had of their own in the natural order of things. So why do I mention this? I mention this because that is key to understanding how Dignitatis Humanae could theoretically, and I believe it does, protect the rights of Hindus to be pagan and atheists to be atheists. The reason why that's possible, even though formerly before Christ rulers could coerce them to be monotheists and atheists, is because when the church was instituted, it really did assume unto itself all authority over anything referred, as Pope Leo XIII said, anything by its end referred to the proper worship of God or extending to salvation of souls. This includes laws that try to make people not atheists, not pagans, and not Satanists. So this is an important thing to be clear about, because an SSPX I was talking to said, how dare you say that when Pope Leo XIII clarified that whatever is sacred or has its end referred to God belongs to the church's authority, how dare you say that is anything other than the true religion, right? That false religions are man-made and they're not sacred, they're diabolical. And because they're false and man-made and diabolical, they don't fall under what is sacred. And so the church can't, and so the state can now, after Dignitatis Humanae, interfere, restrict them, ban those kind of things that are known to be wrong by natural law. But here's the clutch, right? And I already said it. When Christ came, and Pope Leo's, if you read it really carefully, what Pope Leo is saying, anything that refers to the salvation of souls is under the church's purview. And as I said, that includes whatever we're trying to do to help pagans not be pagan, atheists not be atheists, and Satanists not be Satanists. That has now been assumed under the authority of the church. So by Pink's theory, when the church removes its delegation, or the state rejects the church's delegation of spiritual coercive power, it really loses all authority, even over those natural questions of religion. Satanism, I'll still say that's a gray area, but at least with atheism and paganism, it still doesn't have authority over that, because everything is so perfectly under the church's authority now because of the coming of Christ. But it used to, and that's Pink's view, and I'm inclined to see a lot of truth in that. and the reason I see a lot of truth in that is that it we don't want to interpret against the clear sense of what the council is saying. And it seems to me when the council is addressing the modern world, it's not trying to cheekily, hide like, hey, but respect the religious liberty of all the monotheists, but wink, not the pagans. Go at it, right? You know that like there's a real sense that the intention of the fathers after reading that text is to preserve, even those kind of religions. And I think Nostra Aetate, the church goes at length to even, whether prudently or not, you can argue, to kind of talk about what's good and holy, even in Buddhism, which doesn't formally have even a God. So that's an interesting thing. So Father Harrison's view, because of the just order exemption, how broad he takes it, he will say, oh, well, by natural law, you can have the state still has some authority over religion. But Pink is like, no, it's perfectly gone from the state because of that removal of the delegation. So that's an important point to at least clarify so you understand both views correctly.
Yeah.
And honestly, this is something I think Catholics can debate about, because I do think in a way, even in a secular government, like if we do permeate religion in all levels of society, such that in America, for example, and we really do understand that things like atheism or Satanism are radically opposed to the natural law or even paganism, we should probably discourage it somehow in our laws, even in the secular realm. And I have in mind the Mormons, for example. We knew that polygamy, I don't really know if polygamy per se is against the natural law because Abraham did it, and also Solomon per se, it's not against the natural law, but at least our society formed by the biblical teaching of Christianity, which is that it's one man, one woman, at least in the divine positive law, as it was in the beginning. It should just be monogamy. We discouraged the Mormons from continuing their religious practice of polygamy in Utah. We wouldn't let them become a state in the Union until they gave up that practice, which is against, at least what we knew to be divine morality revealed to us, objective morality. And then they changed. And they do this a lot. They used to not allow black priests in the Mormon religion, but then once our segregation law started changing, then you see them change. So the Mormons were very malleable, at least in that way. But I think there's a lot of truth in what the United States was doing. The United States was acknowledging that there was an objective moral truth that was being offended by a religious claim. Yeah. And the fact that it was a religious claim did not exempt it from being under the authority of being corrected. And I think that at least that Dignitatis Humanae says that what laws the civil authority can properly enact do have to conform with objective morality. So it's a tight line. Like, where is the objective morality and just a purely religious question stopping? So it seems to me, and I'll finish with this, that like whether you're a monotheist or a pantheist seems to be a religious question. It's a moral question in some sense, but it is a properly religious question. But the question of your moral action pertaining to your virtue, and like whether you are, polygamous or monogamous or those kind of questions, those because they're based in morals primarily, and they don't have to do with the doctrine about God per se, that I think Dignitatis Humanae is wholly saying is, I think it's probably the clearest thing in Dignitatis Humanae, is that can still be regulated by the state.
Yeah, especially when it comes to like things that are exclusively of a sexual norm.
So where are we right now? Let's see. I think we kind of settled kind of like the whole of Pink's thesis. Did you want to go into some quick? Let's see. We were kind of treating some objections as we went along.
Yeah.
Did you have any in mind that you've heard that you probably want to run in our discussion?
There were a few that we covered already. I was trying to think if there was anything else. I do like to do kind of answer the objection. I guess the only main one that we did answer is that particularly from individuals that try to undermine Dignitatis Humanae from, in regard to like previous church teaching. It's in regard to the kind of the notion of rights and religious liberty being kind of positioned in regard to radical enlightenment ideas of an intrinsic, right to evil or right to error, where as Dignitatis Humanae, it's using the same language but with completely different connotations, using religious liberty as liberty from state coercion, and as uh, not as moral liberty to just decide or think whatever you want. So I think that's the only main objection I've heard, but I'm glad it was answered in our discussion.
Yeah. I'm trying to think back to some of the objections I've heard from SSPXers, and I mean, there's a lot of interesting ones. But one of them that I heard this year was that, and I think he was trying to respond to Pink, and so this was a misunderstanding that I hear a lot of Pink's argument, or at least a mischaracterization of what Pink's saying, is that this SSPXer told me that they even agree that the church, that they believe that, they're in agreement with Dignitatis Humanae that there can be no coercion in matters religious. But what the popes were talking about in the 19th and 18th centuries was not coercing you to be Catholic or to profess belief, which the SSPXer was thinking that that's all that what Dignitatis Humanae was condemning. But what the popes were doing in the 19th century and earlier were saying that restraining someone is of a different species of coercion. This is kind of a hard thing to explain but basically there's a whole debate on the hermeneutic of continuity about what is meant by coercion. We should probably touch upon that. Yeah. And Pink kind of uses coercion in the sense of, well, you can't force someone to believe anything, but that seems clear because it's an act of the will interiorly, which cannot be compelled from the outside. That you can't do that. That's why the martyrs can be martyrs, because no matter how much their bodies are tortured, their interior can still not assent. So because of that freedom of assent inside of us, that kind of coercion is not really even possible by reason. But this SSPX I was talking to tried to make a distinction between that kind of coercion, which should be rightly condemned by Dignitatis Humanae, and restraining. So in other words, yes, people can have all sorts of religions effectively, even in a Catholic state, in all times and all places, even now. But what shouldn't be allowed is the freedom that Gregory the 16th or 15th called an insanity, which is to go out and print their views and speak out in favor of their religion and evangelize as much as they please without being restrained. And this basically this SSPXer, and this is a bigger topic, was saying that the mode of argumentation in Dignitatis Humanae is to suggest that coercion is bad. It's coercion of the conscience is bad. Forget what Pink says. Sure, he's talking about all these footnotes and relatios and behind the council interpretation stuff. But if you really look at the argument of Dignitatis Humanae, what it's really teaching is that coercion is bad in all its forms, and you can't restrain anyone from even doing what Gregory the 15th himself called an insanity, which is spreading all their erroneous views and harming the common good and whatnot. Now, the church isn't saying in Dignitatis Humanae that doesn't harm the common good. But what it is saying is that, at least in this situation, in this modern world where the church's delegation is removed from the state can't do anything about that. It has no authority to do anything about that. And so it shouldn't. And so that's a key thing. But I wanted to address that distinction between coercion and restriction. I think it's a good distinction to make, to realize that, like, okay, to restrain someone from publicly, because public actions are what pertain to the common good, to restrain them from publicly professing their religion is different than coercing them to profess it, even privately and publicly. And so this SSPXer was saying you can't privately coerce or publicly coerce someone to believe, but you definitely can restrain them. because that's within the competency of the state. And that's known by natural reason or something like that.
Yeah.
It's probably already clear by now by our discussion that Pink's, and I just want to make this really explicit, Pink's thesis doesn't fall apart because he puts restraining someone as a species of coercion. Because if you really think about it, because he talks about coercive punishment, right? Like it's basically saying, I don't think it's really materially different, because like if a person goes out and wants to profess their let's say Protestant faith in a Catholic state, right? You are in a way coercing them by restraining them from doing that, because you need to punish them if they disobey that law, right? And punishment is coercive. You don't want to do it, right? Nobody wants to be punished. You have to coerce them into a jail, or you have to put them in the house against their will. You're moving them in a way that their will doesn't want to go. And so you are coercing them. So I think that was a kind of a distinction that wasn't really pertinent to the discussion. And it didn't destroy Pink's thesis in my view as much as he thought it would. And it didn't even address the main, and to be fair, like I need to talk with him more, and he might want to address these points at more depth than he did in the initial thing. I don't want to impute to him like that he was a poor arguer, because I hope we can bring these up in detail, but at least on the basis of what he actually ended up saying, Pink wasn't defeated in that way. You know, if the state has no authority because of the state of what the ability of what the ruler of a secular, the state of what a ruler can do by natural law is different after the coming of Christ. Because of that fact, we're not even in the realm anymore of the ruler being able to say, well, you know, I can act for the religious common good in my state anymore, or I can't even make that judgment, at least in a law. Maybe by exhortation. I think Dignitatis Humanae would like that. That's still allowed, because you can still have a confessional state, right? That still proclaims the moral truths of the faith and even the dogmas. But at least the coercive power, or the restraining power, if you will, it doesn't really make a difference for Pink. That is referred to the end of the salvation of souls and the worship of God. And so it doesn't matter. And so it's entirely in the church's purview, which she has taken up by removing her delegation.
And then I know Poland was mentioned an example, but I think even Brian Harrison mentioned the country of the Philippines, how they've even had state worship before the opening of state parliaments and things of that nature. And let's say too, like a lot of the public schools are run, through the church. So there's still a lot of nuns teaching in public schools. So you can still have things like that. And specifically in somewhere like the Philippines, which has been Catholic for the longest time ever, where they still have the reminiscence of their Catholic culture, where the state acknowledges that, like education, let's say it's important. So they delegate it to the church. And obviously, like I mentioned, let's say offering a mass before the opening of Parliament.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the Philippines. They don't do this anymore, to my knowledge, but like in the 90s, up till the 90s, and the church didn't condemn this at all.
Yeah.
Up until the 90s, the Philippines actually at noon, they would do the Angelus as a country, and it was according to law that all the traffic lights had to turn red and no traffic could go. And you would see Filipinos step out of their cars and do the Angelus. And then once it was done, and it was played over loudspeakers, and then they would go back in their cars and just continue their day. That is an example of public worship. Now, nobody was coerced to do it. Nobody would be, to say the Angelus, I mean. But definitely the laws and the customs of the country were molded around that. Like the traffic lights were stopped, right? To facilitate people being able to do that. And that is what I think Dignitatis Humanae essentially means when it's talking about fostering religion still. Even if in this new order of things after Dignitatis Humanae, the state still can freely promote religion that way. Now, the SSPXers will say, well, it's the way Dignitatis Humanae speaks is a form of indifferentism. because the church is exhorting even non-Catholic states to promote and cultivate religion. But here's the thing about Dignitatis Humanae, and this is probably a good place to close. Pink is talking about, talks often about the discretion of Dignitatis Humanae, what it doesn't say, what it says, what is its purpose. And the purpose of Dignitatis Humanae is, one of its things is to not contradict prior Catholic tradition, but also to speak in general terms through an argument known from reason to all men about the right to religious liberty, because it pertains to all those societies that don't have the church's delegation to coerce in religious matters. It pertains to all societies and all men to know by reason that they don't have a right to infringe in religious activities. And that religious people in all their countries around the world, Catholic or not, have this freedom of religion. And so in order to do that, its mode of argumentation is from what it could argue from natural reason. And that is why reading Dignitatis Humanae is a kind of like it's a troubling experience at first, especially if you're familiar with the traditional doctrine of the church, because you're seeing them appeal to conscience and build an argument from conscience that the state can't coerce. And so it almost makes Pink look like he's a sophist, right? You know, on the sideline saying, oh, the church didn't make that argument really from conscience, is basing it on this delegation and the two, you know, spiritual potestas and the perfect societies. But you will look at the document like, where is all of that? Where is the perfect society and the coercive authority of the church mentioned? Well, the blunt answer is that it's the 1960s, and the church wants to make a credible case to the modern world for this development of its doctrine, which is on principled grounds.
And particularly, I mean, what I often mention in the historical context too, it's, you know, like you mentioned, the 60s, you know, it's right in the midst of the Cold War, where a lot of the, you know, of the world was strongly communist, and a lot of people were being tortured for the faith. So the main, you know, the main purpose of Dignitatis Humanae was, you know, first to make explicitly clear that, you know, that the states have both the obligation of actively promoting religion, which is contrary to communism, which oftentimes it's, you know, state atheism, and particularly to emphasize, you know, I think the reason they emphasized and particularly developed the fact that the state itself didn't have a native right to coerce, it's actually in the flip side of that, it wanted to make explicitly clear the right to religious freedom because of the context of, you know, like the complete bloodshed of people dying for their faith in communist countries.
Mm-hmm. And the church didn't want to undermine that witness to that real truth that those states did not have coercive authority in religious matters.
Yeah.
It could have, the state could have, the Council Fathers could have made a document that sounded as clear as what Professor Pink is saying, you know, like showing the development of how, like, oh yeah, church coercion is legitimate, but, you know, because of this technicality with how the state relates to the church now in the modern world, there's religious liberty. It could have done that. But they didn't want to do it for obvious reasons, you know, like the whole world was watching, and the whole world would have said, well, this is a joke. And we're not going to obey it because the Catholics are hypocrites. When there was actually a real thing the church wanted the world to believe, from natural reason at least, and do, you know, to preserve the religious liberty of its own children in non-Catholic countries.
Yeah.
So it couldn't undermine it in that document, even though we know that's not a real undermining of that. You know, we know that the church's coercive authority is entirely consistent with, at least from Pink's thesis, with this new state of religious liberty that arises from rejecting that church's coercive authority. We know those two are not exclusive, but the modern world wouldn't see it that way. They don't understand these subtle theological distinctions, and the Council Fathers knew it. So they just wanted to make an argument that the nature of, and this is the argument of Dignitatis Humanae to the world, is that the nature of religious assent and acts are such that they cannot be compelled from outside forces, right? And so if you believe, and the Council Fathers wanted the world to believe it, that religion was somehow a good that should be protected in society, that if you believe and acknowledge that it is a good, then you will want to be a steward of that good, and realize that it's manifestly contrary to reason, just natural reason alone, to try and compel religious belief of any kind, just on your native civil authority, without baptism, without proper delegation, because ultimately the church is infallible, right? The states are not. I wouldn't want Donald Trump, that man who, doesn't, let's just say he's not a theologian. I would think even if you're sympathetic and like Donald Trump, you wouldn't want him to be the Inquisition of what is true and false in religious matters and what is right and wrong in policy. I mean, he's got enough to worry about with coronavirus, and that's even kind of a vague, the jury's still out on whether he's done a good job yet or not. But add in religion, which he has no supernatural authority or protection for. And that's another thing that comes up. And sorry, I know I said this is where we should end, but I think Pink rightly diagnoses what's wrong with the SSPX position, that it's a pre-Immortale Dei, two coercive orders understanding of church-state relationship, right? And the way they envision is that the church teaches the truth and then the state enforces it. That God basically split up that kind of process. He gave the enforcement to the state, but at least the teaching to the church. And that is what French people, the Galician camp, believed. They kind of drifted in that way until Immortale Dei and Counter-Reformation theology clearly said, no, it's not like that. There are two distinct orders, and they're clear, and they cannot be confused. They should work together, no doubt, and one can even delegate authority to the other, but like they aren't confused, right? It's like the two natures of Christ; they can't be confused. And so when we recognize that that's where the SSPX are erring, that they still hold on to a pre-Immortale Dei understanding, and they're confusing those two roles. That's why they can never understand how this is consistent, how Dignitatis is consistent with the traditional teaching, because ultimately they didn't really understand the traditional teaching correctly. And the traditional teaching is that Jesuit school of theology that says whenever an authority is given over something, that authority necessarily includes even coercive power, because it makes no sense to, and I've actually been doing this, I've been studying a lot of orthodox, arguments against the papacy. And a lot of them will give a lot of honor to the papacy, right? But they'll say but then the papacy can't interfere with other, patriarchs and other districts, right?
But they'll call him the first amongst equals.
First amongst equals, or they'll even give him a lot of honor. They might. I've heard some even say, oh yeah, he totally has leadership because of Peter. Peter was the head, spiritual head or something like that. So some will even concede that. But what they will always deny is that headship or custodianship of the whole church implies power over the whole church. And what the Jesuit counter-reformists and the popes who followed them later realized is that to give an authority without any power to back it up with force and punishment is a dead letter, right? It's like saying to you, Art, I give you authority to plan my wedding, but then you can't fire anybody who doesn't obey what you say to them. Well, then you don't really have authority to plan my wedding, because you'll plan it, but you'll be thwarted every way. So implied in me saying, hey, Art, I delegate to you the power to do all my wedding stuff, is also the authority to kick anyone out that is obstructing your plan. You have care over it to make it go well. And I think that's a good place to stop. I think we've exhausted the subject, but
thank you for joining this discussion and having the discussion in church and state. Like I said, I think it's a greatly necessary discussion. I think it's one of the most misunderstood kind of concepts in church teaching, and particularly in regard to the SSPX. And I wanted to have the discussion particularly right now too, like I mentioned at the beginning, because it is the election cycle. And so I thought it was a good opportune time to kind of just discuss and clarify this topic that needs a lot more kind of like discussions and clarification.
Well, if you don't have anything else to say, I'll just thank you for inviting me.